Alright, in this video I'm going to show how to replace the center support bearing on Driveshaft, and I also have to replace a U-joint. So this is a 3/4 ton Dodge Ram. This is a 2003, but honestly this same process applies to tons of other trucks. But coming underneath the vehicle first, you'll notice that I have not only the vehicle in park, but keep in mind if it's a two-wheel drive vehicle, once you disengage that drive shaft, nothing might be stopping your vehicle from rolling, so have your wheel chocks on there. And then for this model, it's a 15 millimeter hex heads on those bolts there. There's 4 of them. I used an impact with a universal joint. Fine to use a ratchet, but those can be pretty finicky. If you're not going to use an impact, I would thoroughly use rust penetrant to help increase your odds of getting that off successfully. But impacts do make that a little bit easier. Alright, so I had to actually use just a little bit of rust penetrant and some heat on these bolts up there. And mine were rusty enough that the 15 millimeter just kind of stripped it out. So I actually used a 14 millimeter, one of my older sockets, and I used a hammer to kind of pound it on there. And then I was able to get those off. Now, do be careful using heat. That's the fuel tank right there, so just be cautious. And then, as mentioned, have something to help kind of support the drive shaft as it comes down. And then we'll go forward and get the whole thing removed, and then we'll be able to make some measurements, because you need to measure the inner diameter of the bearing and sometimes the outer portion of that housing to be able to get the correct support bearing. Okay. All right, so now that I got all those bolts out, next step is to separate that. Now sometimes it's just going to come apart, but these have been bonded. They're pretty for quite a while, so they are going to be kind of finicky. Sometimes you can just pound on it, but I don't really want to distort that metal too much. So what I think is a better option is to use something like a pry bar, or this is actually a body panel separator, which has just a little sharper tip on it, but I don't want to wreck that. But what you really want to try to avoid is using a screwdriver, unless it just requires a little tap, because that plastic handle there will just advance on that metal shaft and you'll kind of wreck that. But also important to have that supported, because it's probably going to come off all at one point. So once you have your tool of choice, just sort of get in there, nice hammer, and give it a couple good strikes like that, and should get you separated. All right, next step after getting the center support removed is to withdraw the drive shaft from the transmission. And that literally is just a pulling back of it. But this whole thing is pretty heavy, so you want to make sure that it's well supported. If you have a helping hand, it'd be kind of nice. But if you're working alone, my preference is to actually get underneath the drive shaft. And I'll put that box kind of up front to help reduce chance of impact down there. And then I use my body, like my legs, to support it as I pull back. The other thing you got to keep in mind, you may have some fluid leaking from the back of the transmission once this comes off. So having something to cap that off is nice. Well, actually, we can make this a little easier. Take this back section off separately like that. And then get the front section down. So I'm kind of supporting on my legs as I pull it back. Then I got that box there to make a nice gentle landing. Alright, so there's the sections of the drive shaft. You can see the front section there that goes into the transfer case. Although if it's, again, two-wheel drive, they're going to a transmission. Then there's the center support. And this, how you know it's not good is because that whole part is not attached there any longer. And these do have a typical life they have, and then, that rubber starts to get hard and brittle and no longer pliable, and then it cracks. And then that can lead to vibration, and the whole drive shaft can actually move around, which is no good. So anyways, next step is we have to pull that off of there. And sometimes it's easier than others. You can see I've actually replaced this once before, put a liberal coating of grease on there. So we'll see how easy that comes off. And then we'll go ahead and replace this rear U-joint. Actually, that part doesn't look so bad, but then you rotate it over and you can see part of that seal coming out there. So important to kind of view all sides of the universal joints, because you can see that is not a free play there, meaning there's probably all those roller bearings are gone. Okay. All right, so now I'm preparing to remove that center support bearing, and it was hanging on by just a thread, so I just kind of cut that piece off, and that'll make removal actually quite a bit easier. And this is just a universal 3-jaw puller, and it has a little bit of adjustability with the different holes there. But there's others like two-jaw ones, etc. But this one works pretty good for a number of things. Just you got to make sure it's big enough. Now, most of the time they say don't use impacts on these things, but I actually find an impact works really great, because then it allows me to hold this thing in place just a little bit better. Now, penetrating lube or something on there for a couple days can be pretty helpful, and you do want to be a little bit careful as you're putting tension on this, that sometimes those pieces will release quickly, or if these come loose, that could actually kind of injure you. So just be a little bit cautious about the process, okay? All right, so my puller was struggling just a little bit to get that center support bearing off. So what I did is I stood it upright as straight up as possible, and then I just used some penetrating lube like that in there, and then let gravity kind of pull that into that joint there, and then we'll give it another try. Alright, now I'm about to drive the center support onto the drive shaft. And from my perspective, the best way to do that is to drive with this portion, because this is the portion that is going to meet resistance on the drive shaft. So if you put the force onto that, it's not likely to damage anything surrounding. As opposed to if you drive it on by pounding onto this surface here, that actually places force on the bearing itself. Meaning this is the part you're trying to force onto the shaft, and if you're placing the force on this, then the energy is being transmitted through those bearings inside of there. So that's just my perspective. But anyways, so finding a piece of tubing like this that matches that diameter is perfect, okay? Now, it shouldn't take a ton of force to get it on there, as long as this mating surface is pretty well cleaned up. And then also use just a little bit of lubricant and some grease. Now, if your center support has an orientation, meaning one side's forward, one side's back, make sure you pay attention to that. This one, I don't think it matters a whole lot, But you can see this is the surface that the bearing is crimped. See those little areas there where it's more sealed on this side. So I figured I'd face this side forward, a little less likely to get moisture and things into that surface. So I'll add a little extra grease, kind of clean things up, and then we'll force that onto there, okay? So as you're doing this, pay attention to how far that center support is being placed on there. And I just went and did a test fit, and where I have it right now isn't quite far enough forward. And I could tell that because when I fitted it up to the vehicle, the outer dust seal was flush against the balancer here. Where you can see originally that dust seal runs right around there with the inner main seal right there. So that would actually wear things out quite a bit faster if I left it that way. I could install it, but it wouldn't be quite right. So just kind of make sure you don't put it on too far. You can always push it on farther, but it's much harder to pull it back if you do force it on too far, okay? All right, ready for reassembly now. A few additional supplies. Just a little thread sealer I like to use, kind of extra credit for a lot of things, but any bolts you don't want flying off, I think that's nice to use. Also obtained a few new bolts to replace the originals. You can see those are getting pretty rusty. These are just some grade 8 as indicated by both the color and the markings on the top there. So those will be good and strong. A few lock washers just for, again, reassurance to make sure none of this stuff falls apart during operation. Also good to use a torque wrench. I mean, good and tight probably is just fine for most of this stuff. But that said, manufacturer torque specs are good policy to follow when you can. For this model, 2003, that's 40 foot-pounds for those center support bolts and 85 for the bolts to the rear driveline. Now, that does vary year to year. There's lots of online options to look at that, but my numbers came from the Haynes manual, which is a good old-fashioned book to look at for these, okay? All right. All right, so now that the front of the drive shaft is in the transfer case, I can move towards lifting the center support up to get it mounted on here. Now I did use a little thread locker on those bolts there just for reassurance. And honestly, an easy way to do this would be use a jack underneath here to lift that up. I'm just going to do it, you know, with muscle, but that would be an easier way to do that, and or with a partner. Because you got to lift that up there, and then you got to get that nut on there. I do recommend using a washer. I'm also using a lock washer for a little extra credit there, but we'll get this mounted up. Alright, so before I tighten up the center support, I'm going to get the back part on, and I do have my transfer case in neutral right now because otherwise you'll have difficulty orienting your shaft to the back drive line. In addition, I got wheel chocks underneath my tires because when I go to turn or tighten or torque those bolts, keep in mind you're basically rotating the driveline, then the vehicle can roll. So just use a little extra caution with that, okay? Alright, there the center support is all installed with the rest of the drive line. Looks pretty good, and in case you didn't check it out already, I also do have another video on replacement of those U-joints there. Now I'll go ahead and test drive this now, make sure there's no unwanted vibrations or noises or anything like that. And again, thanks for checking it out, and please like and subscribe.